Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey, and this is your co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what's up, man? What are we going on about today?
We have got Colorado kicking Trump off of the ballot. The Epstein List, which is 170 names, are to be released. The RCMP warning of online radicalization as the Liberals prepare to launch free speech censorship. And the Israeli president vowing to, quote, take over entire Gaza Strip.
So wild shit today. I feel like the whole world is on fire all the time these days.
It is, but then you get pops where there's like a day of 5 overlapping just crazy
stories. Yeah.
It's not, and this is one of those days for sure. So let's get into it. So Colorado's Supreme Court dealt a blow to Donald Trump's 2024 presidential ambitions, ruling that he cannot appear on the state's primary ballot due to his role in the January 6th Capitol riot. Citing the Constitution's insurrection clause, the court reasoned that Trump's attempt to overturn the 2020 election disqualified him from holding office again. This landmark decision, the first of its kind in the nation, hinges on a rather controversial interpretation of the 14th Amendment. While upholding the state's authority to bar Trump from the ballot, the court stayed its ruling to allow for potential appeals, likely to the U.S. Supreme Court. This sets the stage for a high-stakes legal battle with major implications for future presidential elections and the interpretation of the Constitution. So before we hop in here, I just thought I'd highlight that the 14th Amendment was put in place after the Civil War and was put there to ban anyone who engaged in an insurrection against the United States from holding any civil, military, or elected office without the approval of 2/3 of the House and Senate. They shut anybody who could have been fighting against the Union out of holding office after the South lost, but then also made the claim that if more than 2/3 of Congress allowed any certain person to come back,
right,
they could. But yeah, so what's your thoughts there with all that going on?
This is ridiculous, right? Politics have just become a circus in the United States. That's the truth. And this is a wild interpretation of the 14th Amendment. Now, I did some research on this and actually posted something new just this morning because I expected there to be some sort of pushback, right? I expected them to be like, oh, this is crazy. Republicans are gonna sort of, complain about it, and the Democrats are going to say, no, it's what's right for democracy, all this bullshit. So I looked into it. There was a lot of blowback, actually, from just kind of your regular citizen all the way to, like, other Republican candidates, even RFK. So RFK basically said, like, you're breaking down democracy when you do this. You make us believe that we've got this option to have Democratic or Republican elections the way they do it down there, and then what you do is you hamstring the leading candidate with honestly, like, their interpretation is so wild, this is going to get thrown out immediately when it goes to the Supreme Court. That's kind of the truth here. So it's kind of RFK's take. Vivek Ramaswamy, his running mate, is like, oh, then we're not running in Colorado. We're out. And he's basically told all the other Republicans to be like, hey, jump on board because this is fucking crazy. And, I honestly support it. I really like to see that. I think this has been sort of a rather egregious use of this amendment. And the thing is, this has been ongoing for months, right? This is he's up on 4 charges, right? 4 indictments, 91 charges. 99% of it's bullshit. And this to me was the biggest reach. You know what I mean? Because he was a sitting president at the time. And there's nothing to prove right now that he actually did. Like, if he had been convicted of a crime for insurrection and charging the Hill and trying to turn over, okay, I could at least see there, be like, all right, well, there's sort of a legal precedent here that you might be able to make this argument. But instead what you have is you've got, a Supreme Court made up of purely Democrats. At least 3 had the wherewithal to go, like, this is silly. What are we doing here? But 4 of them decided they were gonna give this a go. And it's really just political. That's all this is. Now, one of the interesting things that also came up was, I forget his name, maybe Luntz was his last name. He's a pollster. And what he said was, he goes, this is just going to improve Trump's stock. And I'm like, no, you're 100% correct, right? Like, every time the Democrats come up with this brilliant idea to charge this guy with something new, Trump just goes up in the polls. It just continues to happen. And I think there's a couple reasons for it. The big one, though, is because it's such an abuse of their system. And citizens aren't stupid, and they're identifying this, and they're going, hey, look, like, if he's going to lose, let him lose. And if you guys are so great, then just beat him. Don't tell us it's like, he's ruining democracy. Just go win in a democratic election, you fucking idiots.
That's the biggest issue that I see is the people that are claiming he needs to be taken off of the ballot because he's a threat to democracy are acting extremely anti-democratic.
It's crazy. And I mean, so the last big thing to me that I noted that I think is well, two things. One, this is crazy. So now California's trying to do the same thing.
Yeah, I saw there were 16 other states proposing.
Yeah, like, you guys are crazy. This isn't going to work. This is already stupid. It's going to go to the Supreme Court and you're going to get crushed. And so a previous lawyer at the White House, he was Trump's lawyer, don't get me wrong, Ty Cobb. What he said was there's precedent in the Supreme Court. There's 3 cases of precedent in the Supreme Court that this is likely to be a 9-0 vote. So this is all, like I said, it's political theater and honestly an abuse of the system. And all the Democrats are doing is hurting their chances to win because they're just boosting the guy's stock.
Well, it seems like their only strategy is to try to take Trump off of the ballot, because you look at what Biden's administration is doing in the face of tanking poll numbers, and they actually just had somebody come out yesterday and say that they're expecting a cyclical return to Biden support. That's like, so what they're saying is they're just like, we're going to do nothing and we expect that people will start supporting Biden again. Or the other,
that's a great political strategy, by the way.
the other thing they were talking about too was that, well, as soon as the general public starts understanding that a Trump presidency could actually happen, then we believe everybody will look to Biden to the alternative. And it's like, how dumb do you think the general American populace is that they don't believe a Trump presidency is possible?
Well, first of all, how did that work out the first time he ran?
It's the exact same strategy.
And honestly, like, I don't have any evidence to prove that there was any serious election tampering, but based on the mail-in votes.
Well, dude, there was a poll done on. So this is the whole thing. I actually think Trump has a very good case to make about election interference.
So do I, but I don't have enough evidence to really stand on that soapbox yet.
We do, based on it's what he needs to do is switch the tune from voter fraud to the laptop suppression. That was undoubtedly, and there was actually a poll.
Good call.
And there was a
that's
poll.
actually a good point.
There was
That's
a
good
poll
point.
done right after the laptop came out, and they said, how much of this would have changed your mind on voting? And it was enough. There was enough essentially flip-flop happening there that they said, oh, if I would have known about this Hunter Biden laptop, I would have voted for Trump instead of Biden. And so that's very clear that when the FBI shut down that case, when they took down the New York Post from allowing to talk about it, when they essentially shut down conversation about something that could have very
on
well
Facebook, on Twitter,
could have very well affected the election, then I don't see how that's not interference.
Here's the challenge. You can call that interference. I agree with you, but you get into this subjective, objective conversation, right? If you can show that they converted ballots or they cheated that way, that's objective. I can show you that but this is subjective, where you're saying, yeah, well, they suppressed it, but was it enough? Would it have made a difference? Did it really, you know what I mean? And then it becomes this weird thing because it's this third party group, being the FBI, who at the time was under Trump's rule. So that's treasonous to begin with. And then also you got to look at it and go, well, it wasn't Biden's laptop, it was his son. So it gets into this really nebulous space. So I think, in my opinion, you really need that more objective piece of evidence. And I think that's why I say I can't really stand in the soapbox. But when it comes to like sort of an anecdotal approach, I agree with you. That is enough for me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think the argument is there to be made. And even when you look at January 6th itself, this is something Vivek has pointed out ad nauseum and does a very good job of breaking it down. To me, this whole insurrection thing seems like providing the guilty term before, or the guilty charge before the crime itself, because we really do need to be asking questions about how much agents were involved in inciting the Capitol Hill riots, especially with the new footage that has come out, and you see them leading people through the halls, opening the doors, opening gates for these rioters.
That's even in uniform.
You're like, okay, so let's first of all break down what an insurrection is. An insurrection is a violent attempt at overthrowing a government. And so when you look at what happened on January 6th, most of the footage, yes, there was definitely pieces and areas where violence occurred, but most of the footage showed that the people were peaceful.
Yeah, most of the people
were
looked like they were at a museum. It was just really busy.
Yeah.
Like, honestly, that's kind of what it looked. It was a little wild outside, but once they were inside, it wasn't quite as nuts.
And what I find hilarious too is there's many instances of people going into the Capitol uninvited since. Look at recent stuff that has happened.
That's all for democratic ideas, though. That's not a big deal. It's
if we're going into the Capitol in the name of Palestine, then all of a sudden everything is completely fine. And so I look at this as they were trying to throw these institutions like the FBI and all of this kind of stuff, which is very clear that they do not want Trump in office, that they were weaponizing this label of insurrectionist they were essentially trying to establish that narrative so that they could do this to get him off the ballot and stuff. So I don't think it's one of those things where it's like this happens naturally. It's like, oh, and now what do we do with that cause? It's like, how do we get him for this?
How do you force this situation? Yeah, no, I agree with that. That actually makes sense. I don't know that we ever really get to the bottom of it. It just seems like one of those JFK situations, you know what I mean? Where the thing is, it was very obvious, though, that a lot of these organizations were working against Trump. It was interesting. The other day I saw something, and I don't know how much weight to put on this. I just thought it was an interesting poll. They showed a lot of the previous presidents what they were worth when they got into office and what they were worth when they got out of office. And for a lot of them, it was like, worth like $2 million, came out at $74 million. Worth like $20 million, came out at like $200 million. It was pretty wild. He's the only president that they listed in modern history that went down a substantial portion, like over $1 billion he went down.
Damn.
I believe that's correct. If it's 800 million to $1 billion, it was a big chunk of money, you know what I mean? And that was a reasonable amount of his net worth too, because he was like 3.5. If I remember correctly, it was like 3.5 to 2.5. And I know it's a little bit sort of a gray area in terms of what he's really worth and tax filings and whatever. But for whatever that's worth, what I mean by this is he's not a part of the gang. He's not in there going, do your part, make your money, move on, write your book, retire. Because that's what these presidents all do. And he's not that guy. So he's not a part of whatever this system is. This system that, there's another word for it, you probably know it, but I'm going to call it deep state. But it's this ongoing system that lasts for 20, 30, 40 years that doesn't change with the government. They're the people that are really in charge. And they just use these guys as, for lack of a better term, puppets. It's not really the intention to say that they don't do anything, but I mean, that's kind of the idea. And this guy just doesn't play that game. Whether he's not willing to or he's just, they didn't let him in. Either way, I think that's why he's the biggest problem for them.
For sure. I definitely think of it more of like corporate aristocracy more than a deep state. Because if you think about it, people will call you a conspiracy theorist just for using the term deep state, but you're like, do you really think that, well, we've got, say, superpowers like Russia, who has had Putin in charge for decades, or China with Xi, all of these countries, they have very long-term goals and strategies put in place. And it's like, what, you think America's just going to sit on the back burner and not kind of have underlying mechanisms for things 15, 20, 30 years down the road? It's like, so when somebody comes in that isn't on board with that long-term vision they have for America, that says, no, I think there's a different, better long-term vision for America, then they look at that person as an enemy.
A direct threat, for sure.
What I hate is the amount of Trump derangement syndrome is so deep that it forces a guy like me, who isn't even a fan of Trump, like he would probably be my third option. Like I would go Vivek, RFK, then maybe Trump.
I'd go RFK, Ramaswamy rather, and then I would go with Trump.
Yeah, so it's like,
I just think Nikki Haley's insane. I actually might even go with DeSantis ahead of Trump. I know, but it's Trump. And that'd actually be a close race for me. That'd be a close race.
But it's insane that they put that the charges and accusations levied against him are so insane that it forces guys like us who don't even want to see the guy do well per se, to sit there and be like, no, this is just a complete distortion of reality. And it seems like, though, to that point where it's like, if you're using democracy as this shining example of something that we must protect at all costs, then you can't be anti-democratic. You have to live up to those principles. It's that old Nietzsche concept where it's like, don't turn into the monster you wish to slay. And that's all I see that's happening here is so, and who knows, is it that they actually see this person as such a threat that they will go against their principles and morals, or do they just not have those principles and morals in the first place, and they see this as the whole democratic trope as just a useful weaponization?
I feel like it's the latter rather. I think basically it's just the dress America's wearing. You know what I mean? What is under the skirt's no different than it is over there, Russia, China, all these other places. Because like you said, look, you can't run a long-term business with a 4-year business plan. You got to be thinking 10, 20, 30, 40 years down the line. You know what I mean? That's just how it works. And all of these countries, it's such an integrated, like the amount of things they have to consider in the geopolitical landscape is so complex, and it covers literally everything you see. And like you said, it's ongoing in these countries where they've got leaders for decades at a time. We have to play that way. If we don't play that way, we lose. So we know that's exactly what's going on. And I think that's a really good point to say, like, hey, it's actually a more practical approach. Instead of being like, they don't like us to this or that or whatever, it's like, no, America's got a 40, 50-year vision because they have to compete with countries like China and Russia. And if they've got a guy in there that doesn't really agree with the vision and isn't willing to toe the line, write the book, and retire, they got to get rid of him because it does throw such a substantial wrench in their plans. And that's not quite as nefarious. And I think that allows you and I, or a lot of people that are kind of in the same space as us, to kind of take off the tinfoil hat and go, well, actually, this is pretty practical when you look at it this way.
Yeah, and I think it's pretty obvious what that 30, 40, 50-year-old long plan is for America. It's called the 2030 Agenda.
Yeah, it's a lot closer than 20, 30 years away, by the way.
Well, it's like that's going to be them starting to implement it, have it implemented by 2030, but that's the future they want. The new whole stakeholder capitalism idea, all of this, where, yeah, you'll own nothing and be happy. That's the game wild. I see being played. But all right, let's move on here to another big story that came out this week, which was the Epstein List of 170 names to be released. So a federal judge in New York has mandated the extensive release of court documents, which will reveal the names of over 170 individuals connected to Jeffrey Epstein's trafficking ring. The documents, to be released in just a few weeks, span from 1994 to 2004 and will shed light on Epstein's network of victims, co-conspirators, as well as some innocent associates who may have been caught in the legal crossfire. While the exact content of the documents remains unknown, they are expected to detail Epstein's operations across various locations, including New York, New Mexico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. So do you think anything will actually come of this, or do you think maybe it'll just end up being a heavily redacted files and we'll end up getting no closer than we currently are to finding out what was actually going on there?
I really hope we find out what's going on, but I kind of have my doubts. So one of the things they said already is that there would be names redacted, and what they said was, some of them are minors, and some of them are minors. I totally understand that, but I feel like that's going to be the filter that they use to hide any names they don't really want to get out for now. So I do consider that as sort of a problem in terms of us getting some real answers. The other thing too that I'm kind of identifying with this, it's like, you can only give up so many people without breaking down the whole system. And I was looking at something the other day. There's a congressman saying this whole Congress is so poisoned. It is so corrupt. And this was used as sort of leverage within the group to be like, hey, you don't want these things coming out.
Tim Burchett is who you mentioned.
Yeah. So I look at the world in terms of like this hierarchy of power. And every time you pull out one of these people, like a Jenga block, it creates a more substantial problem for the group. Now, guys like you and I, no one would even know. People would be like, who the fuck is that guy? You know what I mean? No one cares. I'd probably get made fun of because of all the other stuff that I said. They'd just be like, oh, you would too, actually. Yeah, nice. Yeah. People would feel vindicated just because we stand up for democracy. Yay. So there's people on the lower rung like you and I. Then there's people like, say, low-level politicians, maybe a mayor or something like that. Then you get up into this kind of like, these people are wealthy, these people are political elite. Then I think you go to another super high level where you've got like your presidents, prime ministers, and people that are $100 million and more, maybe a billionaire. Then I think there's another level on top of that. Now, these are people that I think are kind of pulling the strings a little bit. I know it sounds conspiratorial, and it's not really my intention. That's kind of how I see things play out, because a lot of these systems were put in place by these people. And you know that because Jeffrey Epstein was arrested 4.5 years ago and died a month later, and we still don't have any information. So that just kind of points to the fact that this system is controlled by these people, and it's there to protect them. Now, the way I see this is you've got this hierarchy, right? Now, this list is going to consist of people on this hierarchy. So there's a couple ways I see this. First, it's low-level people and shakes things up, and what it does is it rebuilds public trust. That might happen. However, there may also be some people that are much higher up on the list that they may be pulling out, and that's going to create a substantial imbalance for a while, depending, especially imagine it's a Bill Gates type guy. And the reason I say that is he seems like he's involved in some capacity. Don't know to which capacity. Some pretty damning photos, to be honest with you, but whatever. I'll leave it at that. But he's so integrated into so many things in society. Right? So if you pull that creates a massive ripple effect. I think it would be really interesting to see some people within the context of them paying the price for their actions is what I mean, not because of what's happened, but I think it would be interesting to see some of these people sort of pay the piper and see what happens. But it's my opinion that unless the people at the very top are interested in a massive, massive shakeup for some reason, shaking up the guys like the Bill Gates, who I think are maybe second rung down, it's going to be low level. So I see it going one of two ways. I guess the reality is because it's taken so long to get any information, it's more likely to be a group of lower rung people who aren't really well known to us. They're going to lose some jobs. People are going to get thrown in jail. There'll be some new court cases. But I don't think it's going to be this massive blow up thing that we're going to see sort of the Bill Gates names on. I don't think so. But anyway, those are the two scenarios I see. What about you?
Well, if I'm putting my tinfoil hat on here.
Let's do it.
So this is just all speculation. But to your point about the hierarchy of people in power, if you look at those very top names, and I look at them more as families than individuals, you can look back at the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, so on, that have had insane control over America for centuries. You need somebody, let's say you are working on an agenda behind the scenes, you need a control mechanism of anybody that's involved, which would be and the most effective control mechanism is usually blackmail. I mean, we've seen this even Russia used to use this during the Cold War, honeypotting American officials in recording essentially they would send girls to their hotel rooms and have the rooms bugged and mic'd and cameras and get blackmail on American politicians, then hold that over their head when they need something to be done. Well, okay, with this tinfoil hat on, let's say there is a global agenda to remove democracy, capitalism, free speech, all of this stuff as we know it, and start implementing a more authoritarian plan for the superpower of the world. Well, you wouldn't just want anybody being able to come in and out of that plan. Right. There's too much on the line. There's too much for people that are involved in it to know. So if somebody's coming into it, you want to compromise them in some sense.
Everybody's got to have,
And that looks to me, I mean, there's been a lot of speculation, and this isn't even just stuff that's in conspiracy corners on the internet. You hear very top level, even like Sauger and Crystal from Breaking Points. They'll talk about this openly and about how it does seem very likely that Epstein was a Mossad agent, was linked to some sort of intelligence. It just doesn't make sense for the riches that he had, how he got around legal issues constantly, all of this kind of stuff. He must have had some friends in very high places on the legal side of things. I don't think Epstein was a mastermind in his own right that was just acting on his own. I see him very much as a tool for some of those higher powered individuals. And I think those people still very much have a grasp on any of the institutions that would be able to do something against in release, say, actual information about these Epstein files. And to your point, I think it's one of those that when you're bringing up about Tim Burchett there, I don't think it takes a lot for, some congressman starts trying to figure out what's going on with all of this Epstein stuff. And like he said, somebody comes in and says, hey, you better stop poking around here. Otherwise, XYZ thing that we have with you, this scandal, you cheating on your wife or whatever it may be, they might not even be involved in the Epstein thing per se, but they can just hold that over your head. It's like, oh, if you want your family and career to stick together, don't go poking any holes in here.
So basically your thought process is the work that Epstein laid is too substantial and too important to whatever the bigger agenda is, that they're not just going to give that up. He himself was basically just a pawn, but he laid such groundwork to hold so many people accountable based on blackmail that they can't possibly give these things up because it's a part of such a bigger picture.
Exactly.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think that's that. I think basically we're both on the same page then. It's going to end up being low-level people, a lot of redacted names, and very kind of a bit of a fizzle.
Because, okay, let's go back to this Agenda 2030 thing where I was talking about there. Let's say you wanted to get on the inner circle of implementing the Agenda 2030, which has all of these implications from internet censorship, digital IDs, 15-minute cities, no more gas-powered cars, all of this kind of stuff.
All the stuff Trudeau's doing.
Yes. So if you wanted them in on that, like let's say Epstein does get in a perfect world, Epstein would get caught, and it was like, oh, he was being used, say, to get blackmail so that we can use against anybody implementing this agenda. Then you all of a sudden have to ask, wait, maybe this agenda isn't in our best interests if they had to get people to...
Yeah, of course. If they had to go this far to lock people into the idea so they couldn't get out of it, to implement their plans, maybe this whole thing is a little nefarious.
Maybe they're talking points on TV about how this is the best thing for Canadians or the best things for Americans, and this is what Americans truly want. Then you have to start asking, like, okay, if it's truly what we wanted and it was a good thing, then why'd you have to...
force us to do it? Why'd you have to give away free pizza for everybody to get vaccinated if it was the right thing to do? Yeah, I get it. That's a good point.
Who knows? I doubt that we'll see much come out there, but it's wishful. I mean, I hope something comes out of that.
You know what? At least, if nothing else, maybe it'll just get the people riled up. Maybe they'll be like, hey, this is bullshit. You gave us, of 177 names you said you were going to release, you released 50 or 60 and they're nobodies and all these things are redacted. Like, keep digging. We want more information. I don't know where it goes, but if that's kind of the only maybe silver lining I see in it going the way we think it's going to.
All right, well, let's move on here to RCMP warning of online radicalization as the Liberals prepare to launch free speech censorship bill. So, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, has issued a warning about a surge in violent extremism among Canadian youth. 5 young Canadians have been arrested in terror-related cases since June, and according to their reports, this is primarily due to an increase in online radicalization. The RCMP notes a concerning trend of violent extremism and terrorist use of the internet among young individuals, emphasizing the need for vigilance among adults in positions of authority. In response, the federal government agreed that there is a need for comprehensive measures to counteract online radicalization and hate speech. For several years, the Liberals have been promising legislation to tackle rising online hatred, but progress has been delayed, in part because of the complexities between combating hatred and freedom of speech. Chantal Aubertin, spokesperson for the Justice Minister, said, quote, "Against the backdrop of the ongoing geopolitical conflicts, we are seeing concerning trends where online radicalization, including hate speech, manifests physically. This is unacceptable. We must put a stop to rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia." So, what's your thoughts on the RCMP essentially saying we need more censorship?
Yeah, I mean, they're just using this as a tool to usher in this new online harms bill, right? So they tried the Bill C-36. They tried it a couple of years ago. Then it fizzled out. They tried again. It didn't work. I think there's a couple of reasons. They were very divided on the legislation because they're openly saying it now. Like, look, it's an attack on free speech. So we have to sort of tread carefully. So because they weren't able to get things through, I think what happened originally was they're like, here's our plan. Let's look at it as 100%. And 90% of it got hacked away. So basically, it was not a plan. And I think what they're doing is they're using instances like the Israel-Palestine war, anything else they can, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, whatever they can use, because it's pretty wild right now. I do agree it's pretty wild, but I'll get on that in a minute. I think they're using it to show how crazy things are, because this is what they did with COVID, right? They go, things are so bad that you have to let us break the rules to save you. This is the right thing to do for everybody. And I think we're getting into the same situation where they're going, these kids are getting crazy. They're going to burn the whole country to the ground. We have to kill free speech. It's the only solution. That's what the RCMP said. Now, look, 5 kids since June. So that's one a month. That's one a month in a country of 40 million people. That in the last quarter let in 430,000 fucking immigrants. right?
And now, do you know with these 5 people, did they actually pull any instances off, or were they just planning and essentially thwarted?
As far as I know, nothing was executed. So that's what I'm saying. So it's almost you're getting people on thought crimes to begin with, right? So they're using this, in my opinion, this is just sort of a coordinated effort. And they're using another organization. Obviously, it's not the government, it's the RCMP. So the government's going to go, well, look at the problem. We have to fix it for you. So I think that's exactly what's going on. Now, when it comes to this conflict, I want to point something out. Like the Israel-Palestine conflict, as far as I know, as far as I can remember, has been the most contentious war that I've seen in terms of how it is spilling over into other countries with protests and with people pushing back against it for both sides, right? So this isn't a Canada problem. And if you go to any major city center right now, you can see that it's not just happening online. So again, what they're doing is they're taking something that's happening globally. They're trying to isolate a small number of incidences, which I would actually need more information on to really say how valid they are. And then they're saying, well, this is why we need to kill free speech. It's 100% bullshit, and it's an attack on the Canadian people. It's what it is.
And I saw Michael Schellenberger did a very good job of, he was breaking down, he's like, we thought it was kind of a self-evident thing to be like free speech, the good of free speech, but he was saying how he's realized that a lot of the younger people in our societies, in Western societies, haven't actually been told, or they don't understand why free speech is such a good thing. And I mean, it sounds a little idealistic, but the best reaction to bad speech or hate speech or whatever you want to call it is more speech, is good speech, good ideas. And what you end up doing when you put in these censorship mechanisms in place is you just shut down any ability to have a conversation between two disagreeing parties. And even if one of those disagreeing parties has terrible ideas, I look at it and go, by you just censoring that person's post or page or whatever it may be, or kicking them off some social media platform, it doesn't change their views on these things.
It sends them into a different echo chamber where there's no one challenging their ideas, which just makes it worse.
Exactly, in which they end up getting radicalized more in that scenario.
Because you need to have your ideas challenged, especially when they're fucking terrible.
And look, I don't think any of my ideas are inherently dangerous, but what I do see is I even have this attitude of with censorship, where when I say something like, I was talking to a representative from Meta recently. I got somebody on the phone and I asked them pretty much like, look, why do I see that my posts on Instagram get 10 times the amount of engagements of pages that have followings way larger than I do? I'll see a video that has 250,000 plays and they've got 20 shares, and my videos get over 1,000 shares and triple the amount of comments, quadruple the amount of comments, all this stuff. But my videos are lucky to crack 10,000. I'm like, almost everybody that sees my stuff is engaging with it compared to these people. Like, why am I getting no algorithm help? And the guy literally said, oh, well, it's because you're talking about topics like censorship and stuff. And I was like, you understand the irony of censoring people for talking about censorship, right? But to that, what I was saying with my attitude there, when I see stuff like that only makes me double down and go like, okay, fuck you.
Then I need to be here and fight, obviously, because this is what's already happening.
And also, just if I get demoralized and stop trying to do what I'm trying to do because you are trying to silence me, then all I'm doing is turning over, laying on my back, and saying you win.
Yeah, exactly.
So and just being a stubborn person, I'm like, fuck you, you're not going to win.
Yeah, that's my motivation.
And so the exact same thing happens for people, even though like I'm sitting here, say, fighting for free speech or actual liberal values. But then the people that have these, say, hateful values, it only makes them do the same thing. It only makes them double down. So I actually see online censorship as worsening any problem. I mean, again, this goes back to something I said a couple episodes ago. It's like the cure will be worse than the disease.
Yeah, I mean, there's one other thing, too, that I would point out, which is sort of a live example of how this censorship game has already worked, right? So when you censor people, what you're doing is you're only censoring one side of an argument. And what did we just say happens? You create a more radical echo chamber, right? So that's exactly what this is going to do And a good example is what happened at Harvard, UPenn, and MIT, where people are like, Harvard finished last in ranking in free speech. People there were afraid to say anything, especially anything with a Republican opinion. So what happens is you've got this society that says this is how you have to feel about every issue. If you say anything otherwise, you're deplatformed, demonetized, or you're kicked out of the group. So you create this dangerous echo chamber, and now they've lost control of it, right? With this, well, we're supposed to support Israel, but they're all supporting Palestine. So you see what happens because you can't control this group. You know what I mean? And they can't control the one they currently have. However, I just want to say, just point that out as an example to be like, look, that's what actually happens when you stifle free speech. Because look, I don't think that everyone who supports Palestine is in the same group, right? You can support Palestine because you don't like the murdering of innocent civilians. You don't want to see 20,000 people get killed. You know what I mean? Because that's kind of where they're at right now. So you could be pro-Palestine in the sense that you're pro-peace. Doesn't mean you're anti-Semitic. Doesn't mean you want anything bad to happen to the people of Israel. It means you want the war to stop, right? And what they're kind of suggesting with this thing that's happening in Harvard is, well, if they just had open dialogue, then this would all go away. That's not quite true. But that being said, all of the radical thinkers that are, chanting for the death of Israel and chanting, anti-Semitic things and wanting those civilians to die, yeah, those are easy things to counteract with free speech. If you sit down and have a rational conversation with any one of those people, they're going to go, oh yeah, I didn't think about it that way. You're right. And that's the problem. Like, they're going to take this away right now because it suits their political agenda. But how this works out down the road is going to be so dangerous. A really good example of how speech and freedom of speech can actually fix the issues that they think freedom of speech is causing is, like, look at somebody like Milo Yiannopoulos, who used to be a massive name in political commentary way back in the day. He, very right-wing troller, essentially. His whole shtick was getting under people's skin and just saying the most kind of like a Michael Malice, but not as bad.
No, Michael Malice is great.
No. What I mean is, he was, which one? I don't know which one was worse, but.
Well, Milo was much more. He would say things for this. I think
Malice is a comedian. I think he's actually really funny.
And I think Malice says, I think he'll make jokes out of things he truly believes, but he believes everything that he says. Whereas Milo would take stances just knowing that it's going to rile people up.
Oh, okay.
And he would just
right.
He would just try to blow up and inflame people.
I have less support for that. Yeah,
so
I don't like that.
But people were constantly trying to shut him down, get him censored, such and such. But it wasn't until he was on a podcast and shared some of his views, which were that essentially he didn't see it as a bad thing if older gay men ushered younger gay men under the age of 18 into what it means to be gay and taught them all this kind of stuff, essentially grooming. He didn't see any issue with that. And then so it's like, after that, the podcast's host, it was on Legion of Skanks, they absolutely just shut him down and ripped him apart. And his career was never the same after that.
Yeah.
He's been nowhere.
No, I mean, I've heard Rogan talk about it and be like, oh yeah, back in the day when this guy was on the show and everybody used to give him shit about it. He's just like, the guy's a nobody now, though.
Exactly. And that happened. That didn't come by way of censorship or anything. It came by way of him exposing his True beliefs.
Cool. Yeah. And then society will sort you out.
Exactly.
Like you put all the ideas out there and society will decide what they like. Don't tell them what they like.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I like the one quote that I'll maybe cap this conversation off with here on freedom of speech is the great Orwell quote, where if language can corrupt, if thought can corrupt language, language can also corrupt thought. And as soon as you start saying that certain language isn't allowed, you are in more ways than one trying to control thought. And I don't agree with that at all. I think people should have complete access to all ideas that are present and then sort them themselves. I have a little bit more faith in people than a lot of these authority figures who think that they can't be trusted to think for themselves. We need to think for them.
And I think a lot of it actually, I'm not sure that it's necessarily they think people are all idiots. I think that they've got an agenda and this is how they usher it in.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's head into the last topic of the day here. So the Israeli president vows to, quote, take over entire Gaza Strip. In a rather about-face turn, Israel President Isaac Herzog declared the intention to conquer the Gaza Strip, eradicate Hamas, and address peace between Israelis and Palestinians at a later stage. Following the completion of the total conquest of key areas in northern Gaza, Herzog expressed the goal of taking control of the entire territory, emphasizing that Israel would only permit reconstruction after establishing total dominance to prevent future terrorism. When asked about the feasibility of a two-state solution, Herzog suggested that the current lack of trust between Israelis and Palestinians makes that impossible, in stating that nobody believes it is currently feasible. So what are your thoughts on what's going on over there right now?
This is the kind of shit that starts World War III, right? So if you remember early on in the conflict, everybody was worried about this spilling over and turning into a major global conflict, World War III. Now, they found some balance with Hezbollah from Lebanon attacking from the north and with the Houthi rebels attacking over from Yemen in the Red Sea. Somehow that seems to be okay. I don't know how or why, but they found a way to make that okay, right? Now, this is the one, though, that I think could have major implications, because the whole world, basically the whole world is like trying to broker some form of peace here. I think at the last General Assembly vote, there was 10 nays. So do what you want to do. Otherwise, I think it was 153 yays and some abstentions. So at scale, people want this to end in some way, right? And that's not east-west. That is both sides, right? Even Canada, So when you say that, and sorry, a lot of this was predicated on the fact that Israel this whole time was saying, hey, we don't want to take over Gaza. We don't want Gaza. We want to shut down the Hamas. They can have the territory, not a problem. So by now saying, we're taking it, we don't give a fuck. Who do you not piss off with that answer? Who do you not upset? And I didn't even, this was the president, not even the prime minister, right? This wasn't even Netanyahu. I'm not even sure what his stance is on this. I'm sure it now is in line with Herzog. But to me, this whole situation just went from bad to much worse, because the Security Council, the UN Security Council, is they're going to be 14 to 1 if the US, vetoes it again. The General Assembly, like I said, I think it was 153 to 10. But this will then not only disrupt their allies, it will really, really piss off the rest of the people that are against them. It'll piss off all of the Arabs, right? So I think there's 495 million Arabs approximately. There's 16 million Jews in the world. That's all there is. Now, there's about 14 million Palestinians, but you see how this conflict gets really, really big when you say, nope, we're taking it. Because here's the thing. What are you going to do with all the people in Gaza? Right? So now all these other Arab countries are going to go, oh, there's going to be some spill over here, because if they're going to take it, then these people are going to come to our country, so now they're going to get more involved. All the countries that were kind of on the sidelines going, maybe we can work through this. Like I said, after that first month, everyone was kind of like, okay, we'll have these little proxy wars, but we won't let this escalate into something global. I think if this guy sticks to his guns, this turns into a much bigger conflict very fast.
I think it's bound to, and, the whole conversation about whether World War II or World War III will start or not, I think it already has. I look at this as, if you've studied up on World War I and World War II, you realize that these conflicts usually start by proxy nations between the superpowers, right. Essentially spheres of influence going to war before the actual superpowers hop in.
Yeah, they stir the pot before it boils over.
I look at it like playing a game of chess, and we're just in the opening stages places right now where these the masterminds are putting their pawns in order and essentially trying to just position themselves on the board before moving in more powerful pieces and more powerful militaries. So people talk about how do you bring about peace in the Middle East and all of this kind of stuff. Well, what's funny is the person that was closest to doing that with the Abraham Accords was Trump. And they it seems to me like the current administration in America shut that down simply because they didn't want political brownie points being awarded to Trump. They got in the way, like the Biden administration got in the way or did nothing to progress the Abraham Accords, which could have maybe, if they had at the beginning of their administration went that route, maybe we wouldn't be in this situation right now, because you would have Israel aligning itself with certain other powerhouses in that area like Saudi Arabia. But it's really weird to me to see that, and I don't condone Israel's stance. I do look at myself as a pacifist. I'm actually just anti-government in the sense, so I won't promote or support any government's ambitions in wars. But I think there's this really massive double standard put on them when you realize that, like, if you cannot comprehend the fact that Hamas has no interest in a two-state solution. Essentially Palestine's, and people try to separate Hamas from Palestine all the time. And it's like, they were elected in 2006, and also a majority of Palestinians still support Hamas as their leadership. So you're like, I do look at the general population of Palestine as being oppressed by Hamas because there's no doubt that it's working against their own best interests. But to me, it's like you've got two parties that essentially won't settle now. I think Israel had been there in the past, ready for a two-state solution. You look at stuff like, say, the Oslo Accords back in, I think it was in the 90s. They've put the two-state solution out there 5 times, and it's been shit on every single time by Hamas. And so I look at it and go, okay, you've got two parties that now essentially sit here and say, yep, we're not going to stop until the other one is gone.
Right.
And you look at this and you go, okay, now all of a sudden it's this idea that Israel, because they're more powerful, is worse. And you're like, they both have equally as bad of intentions. I like, to me, it looks like at this point, like both of them are just wanting to completely annihilate and wipe out the other.
Yeah.
So I don't see any scenario as like, okay, here's the path to peace, and that's not a very popular stance to take, but I think it's the realistic one.
Yeah, I mean, here's the only problem I have with what you're saying. I think everything you said was accurate, but just because two states want to exterminate each other doesn't make it okay. I think
no, it doesn't make it okay either.
No, and I think that's where, like, you know, having sort of a more like a global system in there as a referee kind of adds up, because like you said, like I've said this before too, neither one wants the other one to survive, and they're both fighting over the same piece of land. What's going to happen, right? But just because that's the way these governments want to behave doesn't mean that that's okay. And I kind of see why, you know, people trying to intervene or stop or say, hey, like, let's call for a two-state solution. Like, let's add some diplomacy or add some political pressure to try to get these guys to try to find some peace. Now, that being said, I'm kind of on the same page as you at this point that it doesn't look like they're going to find any. But at the end of the day, do you really think either one of them is going to be wiped off the face of the earth? And to me, the answer is no. I think this is going to move at such a slow pace that this is just going to be something that's going to continue to be, you know, an ongoing war, the same it has been for the last 70 years. So that being said, you're never going to get to a solution. It's never going to resolve itself the way that you just discussed, right? So if you know that they're not going to exterminate each other and neither one of them is really going to give up with any sort of peace, then it would make sense for the globe or the world to put some pressure on the group to find a solution sooner than later, because you're never going, neither of them are going to win that war. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And my thing is, I try not to think in terms of good and bad. I try to focus on what is, because as soon as you start focusing on good and bad, all of a sudden the main conversation becomes what should be. And then I don't see that as a very useful conversation to have, because like there was a good, I remember Thomas Sowell getting pushed, and it was had nothing to do with with Israel and Palestine, but it's a very similar concept where he was sitting there talking about massive problems that society is facing, and they said, what are your solutions? What are your policy proposals for this? And he says, I haven't even given an ounce of thought to what the policy is for this, because laying out the facts of what is happening is a full-time job in and of itself. So I'm just trying to figure out what is going on here, and you can't do that at the same time as trying to figure out what should be done if we don't know the full lay of the land, essentially. Right. And so that's where, like, you know, to this idea where people throw the two-party state solution out there, it's like, okay, well, the solution and the way to peace is a two-party state, and yes, that should be done. In a perfect idealistic world, that would be the path that everyone is taking. But let's just recognize that when especially one party has been for decades sitting there saying we have no interest in two-state solution, the whole concept of free Palestine is to eradicate Israel. Yeah. How do you negotiate? You can't negotiate.
Right. But the thing is, if you don't find a way to negotiate, because both sides have got so much global support, then you have you have an ongoing global conflict. Like, it just turns into it boils over into a much bigger war. So the thing is, how do you manage the situation, right? Like, kind of back to my last point of going, yes, I see that and I understand what you're saying, and I know there's no great solution, but sometimes you have to make a choice between two bad decisions, right? And the worst decision is for Israel to try to take over Gaza and try to wipe out Palestine completely, or take all Palestinian states, because we know what that turns into. the global war, right? That's where that goes. Whereas if we find a way to make these two angry people find some form of peace so they can coexist in some fashion, then the rest of the world doesn't go to war. So for me, it's a pretty easy answer, right? And that's why for me, when I see this, I go, oh, fuck. Like they've mitigated this turning into, World War III in a more clear sense so far. But I think this is going to, I think this is going to go a long way to get us there, unfortunately.
I'm typically not as optimistic as you, and even this one you're a little pessimistic on as well. But yeah, I see no, and this doesn't mean and this is what's so fucked is that if you just exist in reality and you sit here and go, I don't see any path to peace, any workable, practical path to peace at this point, then people assume you're saying that, yes, this should be the option, is all out war. And you go, no, I'm just understanding that with the pieces that are on the table, that's essentially the only option at this point.
I see what you're saying, but I think the thing is, how has this worked so far? Basically what they do is, they get into a war with each other. One of them gives out while Palestine basically ends up having to concede in some way. And then they stop and they kind of rebuild and they go at it again. That's kind of been the cyclical nature of this, right? That has been the way that they are finding a way to coexist peacefully, in quotes, because it's not very peaceful. If it goes beyond that, like I'm telling you, if it goes beyond that and these guys are hell-bent on taking Gaza, World War III. Like, watch out, 2024 is going to be wildly fucked, and this is going to be a big reason why.
Yeah, I think we're headed there to yours no matter what. I
joined you on the pessimistic side of the table this time. Fuck.
Yeah, fuck. I finally got you there, brother. All right, well, anything else you wanted to add for today?
No, that's it, man. Good chat. Yeah. Thanks, everybody. See you next time.